People remember Tony Montana as noise, appetite, and spectacle. But the man said to stand behind that myth belongs to a darker kind of story, one where the end matters more than the entrance, and where disappearance says more than legend ever will. In stories like this, the public does not first see power. It sees absence. Someone vanishes after a high-value operation, and the vanishing itself becomes the first clue that success has already turned dangerous. One person may still believe there is time to explain, time to fix it, time to call the right name and be protected by old loyalty. But systems built on fear do not reward lateness, they punish it. That is the first difference between a movie icon and the man behind the shadow of one. The legend sells personality. The real version, or the version people keep circling back to, sells usefulness. A trusted insider is valuable not because he is feared in public, but because he can move quietly inside the machinery. He knows what passes through which hands. He knows when money changes shape. He knows who is lying, who is nervous, who is spending too fast, who is talking too much. Inside a criminal structure, that kind of person matters right up until he becomes impossible to contain. And once success arrives, containment becomes everything. A score may look flawless from the outside. Access is clean, timing is right, movement is controlled. Even the panic of other people can be turned into an advantage if the plan is built on enough discipline. In that moment, everyone inside the circle can mistake precision for safety. They think the hard part is over. It usually is not. The operation is only the first test. The real test comes after, when silence has to be maintained, visibility has to shrink, spending has to stop, and every face in the room has to remember that survival now depends on looking ordinary. That is where the myth usually begins to crack, because the same person who helped make the machine work can also become the reason it breaks. The insider who understands money may also believe he deserves more of it. The loyal operator may begin to feel underpaid, overlooked, or untouchable. Old trust becomes a narcotic. Familiarity becomes a shield. And once someone starts believing he is protected by history, he begins making the kind of mistakes that only feel small from the inside. A phone call, a private disclosure, a favor told to the wrong person, a purchase that glows too brightly, a visible reward that should have stayed invisible. In a world that survives by blending in, the object itself matters less than what it announces. It says the rules have been broken. It says someone believes the heat has passed. It says someone is no longer afraid enough. That is when suspicion hardens, because organizations like this do not panic all at once. First, they tighten. Orders become stricter, contact narrows, spending is watched, excuses are remembered. Then they begin measuring exposure. Who knows what? Who said too much? Who skimmed? Who took a side payment? Who has started protecting himself before anyone else? Once that question enters the room, loyalty changes shape. It is no longer a bond. It is an audit. And the darker version of the Scarface story lives there, in that shift from swagger to accounting. The movies teach people to look at excess. Real Underworld stories are usually about liability. The dangerous man is not only the one who can pull a trigger or command a room. It is the one who can connect money to names, names to secrets, secrets to fear. The moment that man begins to slide, everyone around him begins recalculating the cost of letting him stay alive. So the figure at the center of this kind of story starts to unravel in a way the legend rarely admits. He avoids. He delays. He reaches out. He tries to hide inside old relationships. He may even look for protection, formal or informal, hoping that one structure can save him from another. But that search only confirms the worst suspicion of all. He no longer sees himself as part of the circle. He sees himself as someone who must survive it. That makes him dangerous, and once he becomes dangerous, the next step is often simple: a final summons. One more conversation, one last request to show up, explain himself, settle nerves, prove loyalty, clear the air. By then, the real question is not whether he understands the risk. It is whether he still believes personal history can outweigh structural logic, whether he thinks being useful once can cancel being dangerous now. Sometimes that final call is answered because fear leaves no better option. Sometimes it is answered because hope survives longer than caution. Sometimes it is answered because people built inside these systems are trained to obey, even when obedience starts to look like a corridor with no exit. Then the person is gone. That is the part the legend cannot romanticize. Not the rise, not the style, not the borrowed aura, the disappearance, the blank space where a man used to stand. The accounts that follow are rarely clean. One version says he was removed quickly and quietly. Another says there was panic before the end. Another says the truth was broken apart on purpose so that even the aftermath would remain useful as a warning. In stories like this, the evidence gap is not always a flaw. Sometimes it is the final act of control. What survives then is not certainty. It is pattern. A high-value operation creates pressure. Pressure exposes weakness. Weakness reveals appetite. Appetite becomes visibility. Visibility becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes proof. Proof becomes a summons. And after the summons, the story belongs less to the missing man than to the system that decided he could not be allowed to remain. That is why saying Tony Montana was based on this man only captures the shallow part of the connection. The deeper connection is not the surface image of ambition, it is the fatal logic underneath it, the way criminal power rewards nerve early and punishes exposure later. The way confidence, once it outlives discipline, starts sounding like a confession. The way one small breach can turn an insider from asset to threat. So the real Scarface story, if told in its darkest form, is not about becoming larger than life. It is about what happens when a man inside a violent structure forgets that the structure is always larger than him. He may believe he is building a legend. He may think fear belongs to other people. He may even think the operation that made him valuable also made him permanent. But that is not how these stories end. They end with silence, where a voice used to be, with people around the absent speaking carefully, with competing accounts filling the gap, and with the central fact refusing to soften. In a world built on secrecy, the final punishment is not always public death. Sometimes it is erasure. And once erasure wins, all the swagger in the myth cannot bring the missing man back.